Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm your host, Curtis Chang. And the Good Faith Podcast is a production of Redeeming Babel. And it's where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. And one question about the Western world is the future of its religious belief. If you read the news about the state of religious belief in Western culture, you would think that the future looks bleak. One news article after another features the latest survey that shows marked declines in beliefs that resemble, Orthodox Christianity in some way. Europe is supposed to be practically post-Christian, and America is supposed to inevitably follow, or so the narrative goes. So this question, what is the future of the Western culture's hunger for God, is a question we should be asking to make sense of where the world is headed. Is it done with God, or at least the God who resembles what the Bible depicts? Well, here's where I believe a key truth about how we make sense of the world is important to keep in mind. And that is news articles and surveys that when it comes to anticipating the future, sometimes news articles and surveys are often not very helpful, because news articles and surveys often, by their very nature, are lagging indicators of deep trends in culture. Quite often, by the time a trend has gotten picked up by news articles and surveys, that trend has actually crested. And it can actually mask other deeper trends building underneath with deeper cultural roots, but one that actually may be more predictive and more powerful in shaping the future. In other words, to anticipate the future cultural receptivity to God, one may need to, if you will, unplug from current events and data and take some time to think and dig deeper. So the kind of person I wanted to talk to about this question would be like the kind of person who has done that, who has unplugged from current events and data and has sort of taken the time to think deeper and read more, in depth about where Western culture is going. In other words, I think I need to talk to somebody who's been on a sabbatical. Oh.
Somebody who has absolutely no idea what's going on in the world.
Exactly. And listeners can hear by that voice, we have just such a person. Andy Crouch, my good friend Andy Crouch, who comes on regularly on the Good Faith Podcast, but hasn't been for the last few months because he's been on a sabbatical. Andy, welcome back from your sabbatical.
Thank you. As you can see, I'm as pale as ever. I'm as tired as ever. I'm not tanned. I'm not rested. But it was awesome. And I missed you, but not that much.
All right. Excellent. Well, Andy, when we were talking offline about what topic should mark your return, your glorious return to Good Faith Glory, you picked this topic about the future of the Western hunger for God. Why did you pick this topic coming out of your sabbatical?
Well, I picked it because of the, actually, I was going to say the greatest adventure I went on in my sabbatical, but there actually was another adventure that is relevant to this that I didn't mention to you when we were planning this, that we could talk about. But the one that that prompted our conversation and leads to this conversation was a very ambitious reading project, actually several reading projects, but that culminated in a 1,500 page book, 1,579 pages, including notes, called "The Matter with Things." We can get into that, but I spent August.
Just so repeat the title and the author.
Oh yeah, yes. The book is called "The Matter with Things." And the author is a British psychiatrist and neuroscientist named Ian McGilchrist. I'd been hearing rumors about this book since it came out about 2 years ago now, in 2021. The main rumor I heard was it was very long, but also that it was quite extraordinary and worth the journey. And I was off. We had a whole month because of overlapping sabbaticals. My wife and I, Catherine and I, both had sabbaticals. And we spent the month of August way far away from news and current events and all that stuff. And I had a lot of time to read. I thought, I am never going to have time to read this book, if not now. So I went on this adventure. It turned out to be just one of the most exciting things I've done as a reader or as a person. Top 5 kind of such adventures in my life, I'd say.
Wow.
Really quite amazing. So yeah, and while the book is not about faith in the Western world or faith in America or anything like that, but what it got me thinking about is the potentially very surprising renewal of the grounds for some kind of belief in something beyond us that I think are the sort of groundwork is being laid in a lot of different places in ways that, as you said, we don't necessarily see in surveys or whatever.
All right. So let's set the context for this, because the dominant narrative is, look, theism is cooked. So explain why. That's my shorthand for this. But explain why we got to this place and why we are sort of set up for thinking, oh man, it's just going to be more and more decline of religious belief. What's been going on in Western culture for the last, you pick the time frame
Yeah.
that makes the notion that actually there could be a resurgence so sort of surprising news for people.
Right. Well, I think there's two major dimensions to this that we have to attend to both, and people tend to attend to one or the other and not so often to both. And it's very common for people to tell an intellectual story, so a story of ideas. I think that's real. I'll say I think there's another instinct, which is to tell, you could say, a material story, a story of material culture, which is the conditions we live in, thanks to the stuff we create and the systems and institutions that grow up around it. And that's very broadly, that second thing is the story of technology. So I want to talk about both because I think they both matter and they actually both connect with some of the people we'll be talking about, perhaps. Inarguably or very conventionally, I'm not saying anything novel here. The Western world, which the Western world, by the way, is kind of the shorthand for the quite diverse agglomeration of cultures, mostly in Europe, that partly through political means kind of deeply assimilated Christianity into the core of political, social, cultural life. The West is kind of the result of an encounter between Christianity and very broadly what was the span of the Roman Empire and the mushing together of those things. So when you say West, you're already talking about a world that had an encounter with some form of the gospel. And we can have all kinds of footnotes and caveats on how well or in what form it was assimilated and what the cost was of that. And I'm not a pro-Christendom person, necessarily, but the West is the result of Christendom. So what happened such that the West became a place that most people would say is not particularly Christian today, at least in its most dominant or influential expressions. And one way to tell it is this set of ideas that, just for convenience, we can associate with three very important figures, Marx, Freud, and Darwin. It's the wrong historical order, but so Darwin, maybe most deeply in a way. Freud would have been most deeply, except he was just so wrong that, and so Freud is like the dead end of these three, right? Yeah. But still, Freud gets at something important. So Darwin, is the figurehead of a whole revolution in seeing the world that comes to see naturalistic accounts, that is, accounts that don't involve any kind of reference to the divine, for how things came to be the way they are, including life came to be the way it is, including how human beings came to be the way we are, that all of that can be accounted for, perhaps through mechanisms, and I'm using that word intentionally, machine-like processes that have nothing to do with any divine person or personality or even perhaps not even a prime mover in Aristotle's sense. I won't go into a lot of detail, but Marx then has an account of history in which there's a very different sort of story going on in history than Christianity tells. It's actually an anti-Christian story, though in other ways it's kind of deeply Christian heresy in a way. And then Freud kind of disables our confidence even in our own senses and reason, and says that the things that motivate us are mostly not apparent to us, and the things we think we believe for very different reasons. And all this culminates, I would say, around the turn of the 20th century, when it becomes not only possible but reasonable to be, and I think it was Richard Dawkins who used this phrase, an intellectually fulfilled atheist. That is someone who does not believe in any kind of God, but who does believe there is a comprehensive account of the world that makes sense. We may or may not see it as particularly good news because it entails that there's no meaning, there's no afterlife, there's lots of things that we thought were there are not there, but it all holds together. And I think the moment when this made the most sense was about 100 years ago. And by the way, at that time, most people, your average Westerner was still Christian. They thought of themselves as Christian. They had been baptized in a church. They probably were buried from a church. And so there's this interesting thing where, most people are not are believers, but there's a group of people who are not. And they say, actually, we have a very, very complete and coherent account of the world that our society has not caught up with yet, all of its implications. But it leads us to the conclusion of atheism. And they tend to be very influential people, very educated people, powerful people. It's so easy just to tell the story that way, but I think it's really important to think about technology as well. And the Industrial Revolution, of course, by the beginning of the 20th century, it had already wreaked all kinds of change in Western culture. It had destabilized all the traditional kind of forms of life that were sustained by and then in turn sustained religious belief, right? And people move to the cities, men move out of the homes in their work, women get confined to the home. There's all these things that happen in industrialization. So we're now 100 years on from that. And what I am starting to think is that both of these forces, the intellectual kind of currents and perhaps the material currents, are actually, the tide is actually turning. There's a very famous poem by Matthew Arnold in the late 19th century, Dover Beach, where he talks about the tide of faith going out, which is a very odd metaphor to use because tides go both ways, right? It's not like the sea is receding and it's never going to come back, but he very aptly and as a poet, he kind of is a prophet, right? He sees the tide going out. Undoubtedly did happen. I think there's reason to think, intellectually and materially, that the tide is shifting. Now, I am not a prophet, nor am I a poet, and I don't know what's going to happen. And I do not at all assume that what's going on is some type of, certainly not some kind of simple return to widespread, let's say, as you said in the introduction, orthodox or seemingly more or less orthodox Christian belief. I am not prepared to say whether that's going to happen, but something very interesting is happening. And I actually think we are in this interesting moment where I don't know if it's quite true yet, but there's this group of people, Ed West, I think, in The Spectator, not long ago, called them the New Theists. So there was this group called the New Atheists that made a lot of splash, a lot of noise. Well, there's this sort of less organized group that we could call the New Theists. And it could be the case that today, most people, just your average person on the street, is functionally not operating out of a position of belief. That's especially more true in Europe than in the United States. But even in the United States, especially if you ask, like, what actually drives people's day-to-day lives and choices, arguably it's not something particularly religious. So just like in 1910 or whatever, most people were Christian, but a vanguard who are really thinking it through said, no, there's a complete and coherent account that has this alternative view. Now, most people are kind of functionally like, oh, well, I think Marx, Freud, and Darwin were basically right. I'm going to live accordingly. But there's a vanguard who are saying, actually, that old, that consensus doesn't hold. Yeah. And there is emerging I don't know if it's complete, but a coherent and beautiful picture of a world that is quite different from what the atheists assume. So,
well, Andy, you've given us a sweeping picture of both the sort of broad currents of thought and of technology and material conditions. Let me play back what I think I heard and see if that summarizes it especially for our listeners and for you. Here's an admittedly simplistic summary of what I think I've heard you brilliantly expose in more greater detail. But it's almost like this, like the ancient classical Christian view of human beings would be summarized in Augustine when he said, my heart is restless until it finds its rest in you. That there is a deep hunger that human beings and even human societies are constructed to actually make it hunger for God. And what you've sort of described is that in the last, I don't know, several hundred years, and let's call it starting from the Enlightenment and perhaps cresting to 100 years ago, there was a movement to say, actually, I've got a different diet for you other than the God diet to satisfy these deep hungers, right? This diet is in these various intellectual currents and these also material provisions through technology that actually can satisfy all these things that you've previously thought only God could satisfy. So I've got this other thing on course, which is why what leads to that quote from you, Dawkins, say, hey, you can lead a intellectually and perhaps even spiritually satisfied life without having to go to the God banquet. We've constructed a pretty decent diet ourselves here, and so there's no reason why you have to accept this other diet, and especially with all the constraints and moral strictures that come with that diet. This diet comes with a lot more freedom. This is, you can binge if you want, whatever. And so that's where we've been. And if I'm hearing you correctly, you're picking up in reading McGilchrist and reading these new theists, hey, maybe this supposedly new diet is getting exposed for being kind of quite deficient in the actual nutrients that we need. Wow. And it may actually cause us to look elsewhere, or maybe even look back, or maybe look back and recook, come up with new recipes of the old diet. Is that how much of what I've just said is accords with what you've said?
I love it. No, exactly. That's a great way to put it. And actually, I like framing it as hunger and the satisfaction of hunger. I think that gets to the fact that these are not neutral issues where we just kind of coldly, rationally evaluate everyone. I mean, that's the thing about anything that touches on ultimate topics of theology and philosophy, is these things are not just ultimate in some intellectual way. Like they touch on our deepest human longings, and there's a longing for coherence, right? I need to make sense. I mean, that's your kind of tagline here. I need to make sense of the world and my experience. And everyone doesn't just want that as a matter of like finishing their like baseball card collection. It's like a longing that my story makes sense.
Right.
And I think the diet is getting thin. That is, the intellectual framework that was very nourishing at the high watermark of modernity gets destabilized. The most dramatic thing is that if you do date it like let's say 1900, classical mechanics seems to account for the whole world. That is, the world really is like a machine in what we call classical physics, right? But the first three decades of the 20th century, all that comes apart, and we get down below the level of atoms and the things you were taught in high school that are these gross oversimplifications with little billiard balls running around in orbits, for example, like like planets orbiting the sun, electrons orbit their nucleus. Well, it's actually nothing like that. Nothing. And by the way, this is very related to McGilchrist's book, because his title is The Matter with Things. And in 1900, you can kind of think the world is made up of things, that is, kind of fixed, more or less permanent objects that don't have a will of their own, have no purpose, have no destiny, have no formal kind of aspect. They just kind of are what they are. And they all behave in very mechanical ways. Well, by the middle of the 20th century, the physicists realized this is not how it works at all. And there's deep uncertainty and probabilistic things and relatedness. And if you want, we can talk more about this. But that means that this diet that kind of purported to have a complete set of nutrients to explain everything actually is missing all this stuff. And of course, science, clearly has delivered all kinds of good things to human beings that we're very grateful for. But we 21st century people have a much more ambivalent relationship to technology. If you go back and look, if you have in your mind some idea of like 1950s film strips on the power of science, and it's always delivered by this stentorian Western male voice, technology will change the world. And we're like, yeah, it sure did. And some of it I'm grateful for, but some of it is really, really troubling and doesn't feel healthy, right? So that's the thing that's destabilizing kind of the imagination that we were just progressing into a post-theistic, naturalistic world.
Andy, I think that people can probably more get their hands on this idea that, hey, technology hasn't actually delivered all the goods. We have more pollution, we have more anxiety, we have more toxic political polarization, we're more isolated from one another. But but you're saying that's tied also to this sort of sense in which classic modernity it can't explain the world in a satisfying fashion. You were beginning to unpack that with this idea that the old mechanistic view of the world no longer holds. Say more about either that or other ways in which the mechanistic, predictive model of discrete entities acting on discrete entities of that world. Why is that breaking down? Why does that ultimately lead to a sense of something's not working in our souls?
Yeah. So this is where I found McGilchrist really helpful, and maybe this is the place to kind of introduce what he does. This book, The Matter with Things, is a kind of a further exploration of themes that started with a book called The Master and His Emissary, which was published in, I believe, 2009. So this is, and McGilchrist is toward the end of his working life, and this latter book is his kind of summum opus, magnum opus, I think it's actually worth this digression. It'll sound like, but because it actually gets to what's happening, which is that actual scientific research, not philosophizing, not theologians wishing things were somehow, but the work of investigating the world, including ourselves, that is our own constitution as human beings, from a scientific point of view, is starting to really complicate our picture of who we are and what the world is like. So I mentioned the physics example, where relativity, but much more deeply quantum mechanics, which basically say that at the lowest, if you want to say that this way, the lowest level, the most fundamental level, the world just cannot be described in terms of things that stay put. Observers matter to the world. Observing a system changes it. Now that is not a Newtonian idea. Like the apple falls at the same rate whether Newton is there or not. But when you look at a quantum system, the fact that you are looking, you are actually involved in changing the system by looking. That's very significant. And then when you look, the only language, if you will, that you can use to describe it is probabilities. You can't say for sure which way the photon that's been imparted with a certain polarization, when it passes through the filter, you cannot say where it's going to go. You can only say there's a 60% chance it'll go this way, a 40% chance. So there's deep uncertainty at the very root of the world. By the way, before I leave that little point, I have not traced down this reference, so I'm taking his word for it. But McGilchrist, in the course of his book, he interacts quite a bit with quantum mechanics because he's writing about the brain, and the brain turns out to be very meaningfully a quantum related system, you could say. He cites a study that looks at the movement of billiard balls on a table. Now, so this is a complex problem. You shoot the cue ball or whatever, it bounces into a ball, it bounces into another ball, you know, things bounce around, right? Now, the classical mechanic would say, well, if we know the initial conditions and we know the exact velocity, position, etc., we'll be able to just map out where all the balls go. And these are large things. On the scale of physics, a billiard ball is a big thing. So the question that was posed was, is there any point, any number of collisions on that billiard table after which quantum effects, that is probabilistic effects, start to actually come into play in the macro world? And your instinct would be, well, a classical instinct would be, no, never. The classical world always operates mechanistically. A more informed observer would think, oh, I don't know, there probably is some number, right? So the number they come up with, I hope I remember this right, I didn't check it, but I know the significant digits in this answer, is 7. After 7 bounces of balls off one another. 7 in this from a physics point of view, very large system. Like these are, these are not atoms. These are billiard balls. They weigh, I don't know, 30 grams each or whatever. That after 7 collisions, you no longer are in a deterministic system. Now, if that's true, what is happening in the human mind, which has billions of neurons with billions of interconnections, not 30 grams each, but very, very small things, very small charges, very small chemical signals that absolutely participate in quantum effects. And with all those interconnections, and as you and I talk, all the things that are firing and all the forces, in a sense, that are being kind of modulated through, fields inside our skulls, that means the level of determinism of what's happening right now is very low. Like there's incredible indeterminacy. So I'm going on kind of long. Can you stand another paragraph?
Hey, absolutely. Go for it.
So
it may just be the two of us talking at this point. We don't know if anybody is listening with us right now, but we're enjoying this conversation.
We're having a great time. So McGilchrist is not a physicist. And I don't know that he'd really, I mean, I'm sure he studied elementary physics as part of his training as a doctor and neuroscientist and researcher, but he's been studying the brain on its own terms. And his big idea, which he really begins to unpack in his first book, the earlier book, The Master and His Emissary, is just based on the most obvious thing about the brain to those who study it, which is it has two hemispheres, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. And there's this whole history in this kind of course of brain study of people discovering this, which people know a long time ago, there are two hemispheres. And there's been a whole series of ways of thinking about it, but McGilchrist spends hundreds of pages kind of unpacking what we now can with reasonable certainty say about the ways these two hemispheres are different. And of course, the first striking thing is that there's any difference at all. Why do you need two hemispheres? Why, in fact, at the very beginning of evolution, do we see asymmetry in neural systems? So the simplest creatures already have an asymmetric neural system. Well, McGilchrist argues that the reason we have a left brain and a right brain is every creature, going back to the smallest little tadpole or whatever, has to do two things, you could say, on a daily basis. And one is essentially find food, and the other is avoid becoming food for somebody else. Right. So when you are looking for food, you are looking for something in the world that you can use for your own ends, right? So I see the plate that's been set for me, to go back to your metaphor, and I zero in on the eggs on the plate or the beans on the plate, and I think, okay, how do I get that from the plate to my mouth and nourish myself? That's the finding food thing. But if you're a creature out in a competitive environment or just the world, I mean, if you're not an apex kind of creature like we are, at the same time as you are getting food, so think of it like a sparrow out there in the lawn or on the feeder or whatever, getting food. But at the same time, there's hawks overhead, there's creatures that want to eat you, and so you need to pay attention to the world around you to make sure that you don't become food for someone else. And McGilchrist argues this is the evolutionary rationale that one hemisphere develops to find and kind of fix the world in place such that we can use it for our ends.
Yeah.
And the other attends to the world as a whole without knowing what's out there, because the whole point is that world out there is unknown. I don't know everything that's happening. I need to be aware of it. And this is the left hemisphere. That's the finding and exploiting the world. And the right hemisphere is the kind of awareness hemisphere. And
so one is more deterministic, the other is more open, just to simplify things, right?
Well, and the really interesting thing, and I'm going entirely on faith that this is, because I'm not an expert in this. I'm not even an expert. I mean, I've read the book one time. You probably have to read it 5 times to summarize it, most carefully. But that's, you said one is deterministic. It's actually amazing. The left hemisphere, it seems, it can be demonstrated, actually freezes a frame of the world. It doesn't see the world as flow. It doesn't experience time very well. It doesn't have a sense of motion. It just focuses on something in front of it that is salient to it and figures out what to do with it. Whereas the right hemisphere is not deterministic at all, is just immersed in the course of what's happening and by the way, this mostly happens not for either hemisphere through a reasoning, like talking things through. It really happens at the level of emotion, or what we would call gut feelings. Yeah. But the right hemisphere in particular just sort of pays attention and is open to not only predators, but other beings. It turns out that my awareness of you as another person is primarily mediated through my right hemisphere. Yeah. Whereas my left hemisphere is only interested in you to the extent I can get something from you in a sense.
So let me pull back a little just for our listeners to sort of help them locate where this conversation has been headed. Is, if we're talking, again, with that starting metaphor of, has the modernistic, rationalistic Western diet that has been feeding this sort of this culture, and in some sense replacing the classic notions of God as what is fully a satisfying diet. One element that you would say characterized this Western intellectual diet of modernity is that it's deterministic. It wants to determine, predict, fix reality, and it presents a picture of the world that is deterministic, fixed in that way. And what Andy is describing is that science itself, which you would think would be at the height of modern Western rationalistic itself, is sort of realizing, wait a minute, actually reality isn't that way, or it's only partially that way. The reality is actually far more open. It's far more unpredictable. It is not like we are billiard balls in the universe. That there's just more openness to reality. And that may undermine kind of how satisfying kind of this modern diet, and may cause us to look elsewhere. I want us to talk about why looking elsewhere may or may not involve a return to Christian theism in a moment, because I think that's the second move we have to make. But I want to point out one other element of Western modernity. One would be the deterministic nature that you'd said, that is this sort of left brain characteristic. Andy, wouldn't you say another is its sort of non-relational picture of truth, right? Like that you get to truth when you strip a thing or a being to its core elements in isolation, not in relationship. You're not known by your relationships. You're known by some core element. And this is why in science, we're constantly trying to split atoms, because we want to get to the core. We want to get to the actual, what is actually at the core. And that will be by splitting things, not by connecting things, but by splitting things and by separating things, right? So that's the drive in Western thought, is we get to the bottom of things when we separate a being from any other being. And that's when we know what a being is. And so if that's been the Western intellectual diet, say more about, again, why recent advances in science are saying, wait a minute, that's not the right way to make sense of the world.
Yes, I'm so glad I can't believe you went this direction, because the thing I was thinking as you described the determinism thing was, yes, that's part of it, but the relational thing is just as important. Yeah. So McGilchrist starts out just by asking, like, how does each hemisphere see the world? And then there's a second question, which is right, or, in what respects is each right? But the right hemisphere, it feels relationship all the time, and not by the way just to other persons, but there's this instinct that I'm connected to nature. I walked outside this morning, as I do every morning, a very cold day, winter day, and there was this flock of birds in the trees, and as a modern person, first of all, as a person who doesn't, who's very happy being warm, I want to go just back inside. But as a modern person, I'm sort of tempted to think I have nothing to do with these birds and with this wider world. But when I step out there, especially I do it first thing in the morning every day, and I'm sort of, my critical faculties are not up and running yet, And I just have this feeling when I step out of a house or out of a building into nature, I belong here as a very small part of something grand and beautiful that's unfolding. And I am meaningful within it, but I am not the meaning of it, And how far that is from, how do you learn about frogs in high school biology? You dissect them, right? But it's a totally different thing to stand very quietly next to a pond as the frogs are peeping or, croaking or whatever species of frog they are, and hear that sound, and everyone once in a while spot one jumping into the water and just feel connected to it. And so the right hemisphere has the sense of connection.
And that is true, deep knowledge that Western scientific rationalism can't actually account for. It can't actually encompass that, right?
That's right. And McGilchrist is a very serious scientist. And by the way, many of the experiments he relies on did use kind of these separating mechanisms. In fact, a lot of what he believes we can say about the brain comes from brain injury, where say the two hemispheres are separated, the corpus callosum is severed for one reason or another, and we can actually observe them functioning independently. So he's not at all saying he's the farthest thing from an anti-rationalist or anti-science, including modern science. In fact, he would say, look, the left hemisphere tells us all kinds of true things about the world.
Yeah.
It's just that the right hemisphere also tells us true things.
It's incomplete, right?
And
yeah.
we've been ignoring it. And
Yeah.
in fact, we've deprecated it. And the left hemisphere is interesting. It's never wrong to itself. So when you have patients who can only operate with the left hemisphere, they got all kinds of crazy things wrong. I mean, it's very fascinating to read about these subjects, unfortunate people usually who have suffered some injury. But when the left hemisphere makes a mistake, and it makes all kinds of mistakes, for example, it ignores the left side of the body completely, because you'll remember that the left hemisphere controls the right side. So the left hemisphere often cannot perceive anything happening on the left side of the body. And when confronted with this, the left hemisphere will just make up stories with utter confidence that just totally pretend that the left side isn't there. I mean, it's really just, it's shameless in its ability to justify its view of the world, even though everyone else except this poor subject who's lost their right hemisphere.
Sorry, you mean the left side? Sorry, the left side does this.
The left side does this. The right does not. The right is actually quite doubtful of itself. The right expresses uncertainty all the time. The right is actually kind of associated with melancholy because it's aware of its limitations. The left is always serenely confident that it has the right world. Yeah. Well, so McGilchrist says basically the story of Western modernity is of letting the left hemisphere take over, when in fact, and this is his kind of ontological claim, his deeper claim is, yes, the left hemisphere sees things that are real, but they need to be seen in the context of the broader picture the right hemisphere has. But what the left hemisphere has done is shut down in culture the right hemisphere's sense of possibility and relatedness, among other things, and just ruled that out of court. Which is scientism, right? I mean, science is using the left hemisphere in useful ways, but scientism is saying that's all there is. I don't see that other stuff. You can't make me believe it, and I'm serenely confident it doesn't exist.
We've been having this really, at least to me, fascinating conversation about the way in which Western culture is set up to hunger after God or not hunger after God. And one of the pictures we've been painting is that modernity, the wave of thought and culture that has dominated Western society for at least a couple hundred years, has been set up in ways that suppresses the hunger for God because it offers a different diet. It offers a different story to feed the longings for our soul. And that one of those, and some two key aspects of that story it's telling is that reality is determined and that reality is separation, right? I'm simplifying things, but saying that reality is found when you can fix things in very deterministic ways, and reality is found when you reduce things to this essence, not in its relationship. Yes. So this is the difference between, and an elegant way to put this is left brain, right brain, is that the left brain, it turns out, is actually far more deterministic. The right brain is far more open. The left brain is sort of operates in isolation. The right brain is much more hungry for relationship and connection. Okay, so if what we're saying is that science itself, probably along with material conditions, are showing this greater dissatisfaction with this deterministic and separating mindset and lifestyle, frankly, that we've been trapped in or we've been fed, I guess the hope would be, wow, that may make us long for something better. And the Christian then, in me, says, could that something better be satisfied by the gospel? And so make the case for, again, we're not predicting that will happen. We're not saying for sure that, but why might this lead us to some openness for a return back to the gospel properly understood and properly reconstituted, perhaps?
Yeah, well, I want to start with that point of properly understood because, there are modernistic gospels. Right. That is, or modernistic accounts of what Christians believe. And those are not, I mean, the really interesting thing is those just become less and less plausible.
That's
the
right.
more that modernity itself becomes implausible.
Yeah.
And I don't know if this is not perhaps quite what you want me to say or want to hear at this moment, but I actually think that these developments in human understanding of ourselves and the world require us to go back very seriously and assess the Christian tradition for times when it itself has not been true to the Creator God and the world the Creator God has
that's
made.
right.
So to give you an example, I mean, well, to go to
No, keep going down this line. You're tracking exactly where I want you to go. So keep going.
So to say it positively, I mean, if you are looking for, in some ways the deepest problem in Western philosophy, but Western philosophy is very good at asking fundamental questions. So maybe this is kind of one of the deepest human questions is the dominant reality the one or the many? That is the world full of independent things, or is the world all connected? Well, you can quickly see that maps onto, the left hemisphere is going to say lots of things I can eat. And then the right hemisphere is going to say all is one, right? So if we are trying to account for the fact that both of these hemispheres tell us some truth, and we need both, is there an account of the world that both preserves particularity and harmony, or not just harmony, unity, right?
Yeah.
Well, the doctrine of the Trinity
yes.
is really compelling in this context. Right. And by the end of the 1,500 pages of McGilchrist, now McGilchrist is not writing in this book as a Christian. I think he's on a spiritual journey, which is his own to articulate, but that's not his purpose in the book, certainly. By the end of the book, I'm like, you need the Trinity. You need the Trinity, because he's calling for us to recover the interconnectedness of all things.
Yes.
And the three persons of the Trinity are interconnected. The way parents and children, the way a father and a son are interconnected. The way our breath is connected to our body, right? The breath being cognate with the word for spirit. So you need the Trinity to give you both, because what's actually a bit of a risk with, I think, McGilchrist's presentation is that he's understandably trying to correct this Western particularity with this kind of monism or oneness, right? All is one. But if you do that too much, you end up collapsing everything into oneness. And I think that's we don't want to go.
We don't want to replace left brain dominance with just right brain dominance.
Yes,
right?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. And the Trinity is this amazing, holds together those things. Now, so that's a way in which you look at kind of, I turn the last page of McGilchrist and I'm like, well, first of all, I have a specific book people ought to read. There's a book called The One, the Three, and the Many.
Colin Gooden. I was just thinking about
Colin
that
Gooden
book.
is an incredible book, which is very on point to this. And I'm like, okay, please go read that next after you read this book, because Gooden sees how, in fact, the Trinity is the solution to this fundamental Western problem. On the other hand, and I'm going a bit out on a limb here, because this will require, probably will require a century to think through, and smarter minds than me. I won't say than us, but at least than me.
No. Say us. Please say us.
We are very fond in Western Christianity of the creator-creation distinction, because it is a fundamental idea of biblical religion that the creator is not the creation. The creator is not just in creation. The creator is somehow separate from creation, and the creation is just a gift of the creator, not a necessary feature of the creator, and vice versa in a way. But when you start really wrestling with how interconnected all things are, and how present the divine, however we understand the divine, has to be in the flow of all things, you do have to rethink some of the easy ways that we've just said, well, God is over here and the world is over here.
Right.
And Christians
have
done
that.
This
is to your point of even basic physics, like the very concept, I'm going to be using as a layman's understanding of entanglement, right? That particles are entangled. And so if you're to say the creator is in relationship with the creation, there's a, if you will, a theological entanglement that is happening there. Right?
Yes, exactly. Now, this is another place where we, if I can put it this way, we have kind of an advantage, because we have the incarnation in which the creator, the one through whom all things
get entangled.
Gets entangled. So it's very convenient that we have that, because if we had a really, truly, purely like Aristotelian religion or something like that, I have only a lay knowledge, but Islam in a way has a very strong creator-creation distinction, far stronger than Christianity. But with the incarnation, you have a way to theologically think this through, these new findings, without being too alarmed that you're going to be led into some kind of all is one, maybe more of a Buddhist conception of reality. So, but it's going to require some really serious work, and we can't prejudge it based on a Western tradition that sometimes has paid very little attention to the relational nature of the Trinity, the relational nature of God,
or the openness of how we ought to think about the future and God's work in the future, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And listen, I inhabit the Orthodox tradition, that which has been believed at all times by everyone, is as Christians. I have no interest in straying away from that, because on what grounds could I justify that? I don't think I can. But I think we have to be willing to stretch our understanding of God and the world as these findings kind of get solidified and clarified. And I think that's going to be threatening. A lot of people want to believe that God is in control.
That's right.
People really want to be able to say that. But what if control is not a feature of the system of the world? What if there is,
or at least our definition of control is a outdated definition of control? Yeah.
But I don't know. My own view is that word is it's a dead end. I don't think we're ever going to come up with a definition of control. Now, sovereign, which is something else we predicate to God.
That's right.
I'm actually very comfortable believing there's a way to define sovereign that is true to what Scripture says.
No, that's right.
But God is in control. I personally believe that is not, it doesn't map onto the world as it is. The world is not a controllable system. Yeah. And this is challenging. It's more challenging for some theological streams than others. And I admit I'm a kind of a Wesleyan Christian, and so I'm less troubled by this, and I understand. And I'm not
the
at all.
The Calvinists are fleeing from this podcast as we speak.
And I'm not trying to push anyone to quickly abandon really important streams of tradition and reflection. It's just that we have to keep wondering, did we miss something?
Exactly. Well, this is where I love the way you put it, is that we have to be willing to be a disciplined and humble practitioner of going back to our old theologies and saying, is this really the gospel? Is it, or does the gospel have to result with this formulation? Or is this just a formulation we came up with based on the gospel, but not the gospel itself for a particular time? And it contains, therefore, some contingent things that were maybe okay for that moment, but in a different era, when we know differently, the recipe has to look different. The basic ingredients are the same, but we have to cook this a little differently, right? If we were to actually prepare it from it. I have an example of this that I've been thinking a lot about, that hopefully maybe brings this home to listeners in a very practical way. Well, what is the most powerful, one of the most powerful and just almost cliched attacks on Christianity? Well, it's the problem of theodicy, right? Or another way to put it, it's the problem of evil. Like, if evil things happen in the world, if people die from cancer, or wars happen, or murders happen, how can there be a God? And the way it's posited is the classic, either God is all powerful or all loving, right? So if he's all powerful, but these things happen, it must mean he's not all loving. Or if he's all loving, then he can't be all powerful because these things happen. And there's a great book written by a guy named Michael Buckley called At the Origins of Modern Atheism. And what he does, this is another long, very weighty book, but he's a deep scholar who basically traces the origins of modern atheism, at the origins of modern atheism. And he makes this brilliant argument that is historically, to me, was rigorously shown, that if you trace all the major themes of modern atheism, like this theodicy problem, you can trace at the origins is some theological move made long ago by Christians that actually was, he would say, not faithful to the deep gospel. So how does this work in theodicy? Well, it turns out when you are defining sovereignty, you dial back to the medieval theologians, they kind of had a vested interest in defining sovereignty a particular way. They were employed by the sovereigns of the day to come, and so they had a very vested interest to define sovereignty very much in this left brain model, to say, you know what sovereignty is? Sovereignty is when the big bowling ball, the king, gets to actually run over, like, kind of have its way, and everybody bounces off of the big bowling ball that is the king. Like, and it's the king in isolation, inside, and that's the picture of sovereignty, right? And so if you have that picture as your picture of power, then you have a theodicy problem, right? Then you have a problem because, like, well, gosh, if he really does control everything, if his word dictates every possible outcome in a deterministic, predictable fashion, then if something evil happens, you have to trace it back to the sovereign, right? That's where the logic. And what Buckley's arguing is, wait a minute, that's an overlay on the biblical notion of sovereignty. What if God's power is actually less deterministic, actually is more probabilistic, is open to many possible outcomes, and his power can actually encompass and hold a greater, infinite level of probabilities, if you will, then we're not reduced to this, because, like, God can actually open up, he can still be in power, but bad things can still happen, but that doesn't mean he's lost control of the system, or not lost sovereignty over the system. Let's not use the word control. Yeah. And if people think, well, wait a minute, that's not power, I encourage people to read Andy Crouch's book on this very subject of power. It's called Power. But
Playing God.
Or Playing God, right? Playing God.
Yeah.
Sorry. Or if you want to know how this works in your own life, think about yourself as a parent, right? You as a parent, I'm a parent now of young adults. I'm still exercising power, but it is not deterministic. It is not. It is very probabilistic in how I exercise power. It's like, okay, maybe I can shift the odds this way and that way, and open up this possibility. But I cannot dictate what everything is happening. And if we think of the picture of God that is most conveyed, is as a father. That's what Jesus said. It's your heavenly Father. So if we were to think, well, how does God exercise power? We should be thinking in relational terms, not as the big bowling ball that basically everybody bounces off of, but as the big father who is actually able to encompass all of the family and all the choices, including wrong choices that are being made, or just the wrong things that are happening in the world, and yet still guide this family to its ultimate intended destination in the end, encompassing all of this. And so, that's an example. Like, if you have this, if you're less deterministic and actually more open, if you are less separationist and more relational, some things that we think are theological conundrums go away.
Yes.
It's really, we have to excavate. So when we, back to my meta metaphor, this is why, if we are sensing the culture is actually hungry because the secular modernistic diet is not satisfying, it doesn't mean we just offer up the old reworn microwave plates of old Christian theology. We have to actually look back and say, hey, did we get our diet wrong, our own diet wrong in some way? And do we need to actually reconfigure things in a way that's still truthful to the essential ingredients of the gospel, but now is actually is going to actually taste like it's actually meeting a felt hunger?
And by the way, I think what is so impressive about not just Ian McGilchrist, but a number of other people we could talk about if we had more time, who are also part of this new theism kind of trend, is that they themselves have done this. They came into their work with very fixed ideas. Well, I don't want to attribute fixed, but strong, viable belief systems. But you can see in the course of their work, it starts to get rocked by the evidence, right? And there's this deep humility, to me, this incredible humility in someone like McGilchrist, to it just discover and admit and take great risks, professional risks, I would say, to say, we that is kind of the scientific guild, have had it wrong in what we've claimed are the deliverances of our findings. Yeah. And it is a Christian virtue to submit myself to the tradition, because it knows more than I know, for sure. But I just think it's also a virtue to be humble in the face of just how much we haven't known. And I'm just so confident when I finish this book does not, like, on the last page, there's not a sort of coherent articulation of Christian theism, certainly.
Yeah.
But I finished and I thought, the gospel answers this. The gospel
Mm.
can hold all of these insights and better than actually the final pages of the book itself do, in my own view.
Mm.
And I just think we have every reason to be hopeful, but we can't be sort of predetermined about how that's going to play itself out over the next 100 years.
Got to awaken the right brain in our own theological and spiritual lives, it sounds like. We're talking about the possibility at this deep cultural level for a dissatisfaction with the old Western secular rationalistic narratives, and potentially that might open up a hunger for an account of reality that actually is more truthful to the gospel if Christians themselves are willing to examine ways that we may have presented a gospel that was truncated or that was also captive to the very forces of Western rationality and modernity. I hope you've been following along. I hope on the break, all of you Calvinists, you weren't scribbling angry emails to me. Oh my gosh, he's going open process theology now. So I don't know what I think. I just think we need to ask these questions. So, Andy, for this last segment, I mean, we've been talking sort of very highfalutin level, which is important. And hopefully it is. I'm hoping that this is a gift to our audience. But I want you to pastorally bring it down back to the listener who is not a theologian, who is not a pastor, who is just a Christian. And how should they absorb some of these insights that you're talking about in their own lives, much less the shape of Christian theology?
So I think the first thing is simply to be confident and hopeful. I mean, when I read a book like this one that we've been talking about, I'm just aware of how little I know and how inadequate I am to make even an intellectual contribution to the world. I'm a very small, person, and there are people in the world who just can make a greater contribution. And just to be hopeful that there are people like that, who, whether they start out as a Christian and make a contribution from there, or they start out from a very different place but follow the evidence where it leads. Just be hopeful that something's happening that is shaking the foundations of our world in a good way. The foundation, like the misbuilt foundations. That is going to be good for our children's children. I don't know if this is quite what you were imagining, I might say, Curtis, but I think some of this research and these themes is an invitation to do something very different as, if you will, as apologists for the gospel. So if apologetics is the business, you could say, of trying to make the case for something you believe, especially if you're a Christian believer, I think we've often thought that what I have to do to be a good apologist is become really good at left brain activities. That is, I have to read these very well-ordered, like some of the apologetics books are literally written as outlines,
flowcharts.
Roman numeral 1, point A, point 1, or flowcharts or diagrams. And I sort of have to make my brain work that way. And some brains work that way and it's glorious. And I'm not saying there's not a place for it. But here's three things. The third feels strangely cheap. I'll say the three. I'm really convinced of the first two. The third is kind of a catch-all for other things. We need to do more with music, because music, and McGilchrist does a lot with music. And McGilchrist actually argues in The Master and His Emissary that music came before language. We were singing before we spoke. And there are very profound reasons to think this. It's not just a speculation. And music is flow. It is flow with particularity. It's not just an eternal chord. It flows through time. The notes come into being, but they pass out of being. They connect to each other. They only make sense insofar as they connect. And that's just like a rational description of how music works. But the whole point is, music, when we're in it, when we experience it, is an invitation to participation in relationship and in possibility, and often, in the best music, in one way or another, improvisation. And we just have to be, frankly, I think we need to expect better music in our Christian settings, make better music. I don't mean Bach. Bach is amazing music, but I mean like really serious efforts to make the most of the instruments we have in the human body and the human voice and so forth. The second thing is, if you want to be a good apologist, take your friends into nature.
Mm.
Go somewhere where the Milky Way casts a shadow. We're going to have an opportunity for this in a certain sense on April 8th, when most of North America gets a solar eclipse, at least partial, and a big path of totality. And our neighbors are going to be like doing everything they can to get into that path. And the more secular they are, actually, the more likely they're going to be like arranging their lives to get into the path of the eclipse. Because I've never been in a total eclipse. I've been close, but I've never been in one. But what I hear is it's a strangely spiritual experience, because you kind of can kind of feel the cosmos moving in real time.
Yeah.
And that's just one thing. But there's a fabulous book by oh gosh, I'm not going to remember his name at this moment, but it's called The Embers and the Stars, by a Czech philosopher. It's kind of a difficult book in some ways, but a beautiful book about this philosopher who taught at Boston University, who lived for a year a mile away from the nearest electric power line, and he built a little cabin in the woods in southern New Hampshire. And he makes the case that when human beings return to the natural environment that we are part of, without the technological apparatus that insulates us and separates us from it, we cannot help but discover that the universe has meaning, and that there is the subtitle of the book is An Inquiry into the Moral Sense of Nature. The Enlightenment says nature has no morality; it's completely amoral. And Chopek, no, that's not his name. Kohak, Erazim Kohak. Kohak says no. When you actually live in the midst of it, you discover there is good and bad. There is truth and falsehood. You yourself have good and evil within you. You yourself have truth and falsehood. And between the embers and the stars, that is, between the dying light of our own fire and between the dim light of the stars, when you're out there in that forest clearing, you discover something about yourself and the world. And to the extent we're like locked in social media discussions, they're like 10 layers deep in technology with other people. I just don't know how much you can do. But I tell you, anybody you are talking with, if you went rafting together, if you went camping, went on a hike together, something would happen that would be worthwhile. And this is the third that felt just too easy, but it just suggests that becoming good at knowing people, becoming good at relationships, I mean, really good at it. Good at knowing a person. David Brooks has this new book on how to know a person.
He was a fellow previous guest we've talked about. Yes, so, that's right.
Like, don't underestimate what that can do to make the gospel, which is, of course, about God knowing us. Right? Right now we see through a mirror dimly, but one day we'll be seen face to face. And face-to-face encounters actually matter for the plausibility of the gospel in our time. So
well put.
Yeah. That's what I'm going to do with this, more than, write books about McGilchrist. I'm not going to do that. But I want more music. I want more nature. And I just, my quest in my life is, how do I be a faithful friend? So
I love all three of those. The third one did not feel cheap at all. I think they all hold together in a coherent account of what it means to be human in a way that takes us, I think, or at least inclines us naturally back to God. Whether people take that offer, follow that, but it lays a breadcrumb for people to follow, right? I'll offer one last one, which is, I want to encourage all of our listeners to consider like 15 minutes a night of solitude and contemplation. Just to do that, because the act of solitude and of contemplation, of quiet contemplation by yourself, all devices off, you're not trying to think of anything. It is a quintessentially right brain activity. It is not deterministic. You're not sitting down to achieve anything. In fact, you have no idea what the next 15 minutes is going to be like. It is just, you're just open, right? So you're cultivating that open posture versus closed deterministic posture. And it is actually quite relational, because you are expressing a kind of a hunger for God. You're saying, I by myself can't complete this experience. I'm just open to a God. It opens a space, an invitation to God, which God will fill in some way, maybe in some discernible ways, maybe in undiscernible ways, but you are acting on faith. There is a God out there who seeks and wants to relate with me if I just make the space for that. And so I just encourage you, like 15 minutes, you can schedule it, or here's another cue for you for when to do this is, if you ever feel this hunger in you, that is like an itch. It's like a little itch that just you want to fill by, that you previously have filled by picking up your social media feed, by picking up your phone, or by watching what might be on in the latest streaming offering. If I think human beings know this, right? There's this itch that's like a little tickle of emptiness that we are so easy to actually fill with junk food, to just make it go away. If you're willing to just let that itch blossom a little bit into a hunger, and then meet it with one of the three that Andy said, or just 15 minutes of solitude, see where that goes. And that, I think itself, if you do that, that in itself will blossom into an apologetic. I am convinced that the apologists, the most compelling apologists of the day, for the next century, will be the mystics and the contemplatives, because they will articulate an experience that will seem so different and yet so compelling to those still trapped in a closed modernistic deterministic worldview, that they'll want to find out more. I found that to be the case. I read all the Peter Kreeft, the apologetics and so forth. I've gotten more interest from non-Christians when I just described to them my life of contemplative prayer than any particular rational argument I've ever advanced. Well, Andy, do you have any other final words for our people?
Read long books. If you choose wisely, it's really, really worth it. I tell you, man.
Well, that's great. Well, we are blessed, Andy, to have you gone on a sabbatical and to come back bearing some riches that I think are going to continue to feed you and feed us and feed the church. And so we're super excited that you'll be coming back again as our regular guest. Andy, thank you so much.
You bet.
All right, listeners. Thank you for listening in and the sort of meandering, but hopefully fruitful conversation for you. We will by the way, this is the kind of conversation that when you go out into nature and you sit together around a campfire, these are the kind of conversations that you have as you glance up into the stars and ponder these deep questions. And this is why I end every podcast by saying, next week, once again, join us around the campfire.